There are many things that I do in my books that I'm often being told is not long-term. One of them is using the word American. One of them is referring to contemporary events, that it sort of limits the book to this moment. But too bad. I feel like this moment is a moment that needs to be marked. The events in the books are, I wouldn't be writing them if what was happening in the United States wasn't happening. So it seemed to me really important to name it American because it's coming out of the unthinkable dynamics occurring in our country.
Citizen is not from this year, it's from 2014. Mm-hmm. So it's written in another era, a recent but another era, isn't it?
It's written in the era that is this era without the amplification of Trump.
Yeah. Because because you might think that this would be a book you would put out now because of Trump, but Trump is more like a result of the stories that we hear, the poetry that we read in Citizen.
Trump, Trump is his own performance. But the way in which Trump ran for president, Wallace ran before that, and we had other politicians. When Wallace ran for governorship in Alabama, he ran first on education and housing, let's say, I think it was, and he lost. And he said, "I will not be out-niggered again." And so after that, he ran on segregation and racial politics, anti-black racism, basically. And he won, and he went on to win the next 5 elections. This politics of anti-immigration, anti-black racism, misogyny, those attitudes have gotten people elected from 400 years ago to now. Trump is the only one who says it both in public and private and uses it without retribution and shame. But he's not new.
He's not new. I think that now that we talk about words being said, this is a collection full of so-called microaggressions. They don't seem very micro to me, but that's what you call them. We'll get back to that. But could you just read this?
Of course.
For us.
Certain moments send adrenaline to the heart, dry out the tongue, and clog the lungs. Like thunder, they drown you in sound. No, like lightning, they strike you across the larynx. Cough. After it happened, I was at a loss for words. Haven't you said this yourself? Haven't you said this to a close friend who early in your friendship, when distracted, would call you by the name of her black housekeeper? You assumed you too were the only black people in her life. Eventually, she stopped doing this, so she never acknowledged her slippage. And you never called her on it. Why not? And yet, you don't forget. If this were a domestic tragedy, and it might as well be, this would be your fatal flaw, your memory, vessel of your feelings. Do you feel hurt because it's the all black people look the same moment, or because you are being confused with another after being so close to this other? Well, when I came to the United States at 7, my mother had been, it was a British colony that then gained its freedom. And my mother's family was sort of a middle-class black family. Her mother or grandmother had been married to a Scotsman, and they had a lot of property. And then they came in the 70s, or the end of the 60s, when the United States was pulling in medical people from the islands to fill those jobs in the United States. And so she worked in hospitals her life. And so she told us two things. She said, there are two things, I'm not making this up. My mother said, okay, we are now here in the States. Do not trust white people. That was her first order of business. The second was, you can never go to public school. They're bad. So those are the two pieces of information she had been given coming into the United States. Do not trust white people, and do not send your children to public schools. So consequently, I was not sent to public schools. And I think how she knew this, how many people know Mary Seacole? A few of you. Mary Seacole is this incredible woman who lived in the 1800s, Jamaican woman who lived in the 1800s, and she was a nurse, self-taught. She was sort of Florence Nightingale, but black. And during the Crimean War, there was a call for nurses. So she took a boat to England and went to Florence Nightingale's office and said, I'm reporting to duty. And they said, no, not you. And she was devastated, but she ended up going. But the reason I bring her up is in her diary, she writes, the difference between the British and the Americans, they're both racist, they both hate black people, but the Americans will kill you. And she wrote that in the 1860s. Because she was in a situation where there were two boats coming from Panama, and they said, you can take the American boat or you can take the British boat. And she said, I'll wait and take the British boat, even though it'll take longer, because neither of them like me, but the Americans will kill me.
That's tough knowledge. That might lead us to talk a little bit about something that puzzled me, but then I thought again, and it's that you talk about a self which is at the same time a personal self, Claudia Rankine, here and now, and then a historic self. Can you talk a little about this?
Well, I think this is always the case when you're talking about racism in the States, because people say, what are you talking about? You went to some of the best colleges and universities.
No public schools.
No public schools. You teach at Yale University. You have a great salary, a nice house, a pretty car, whatever. So you have somehow classed out of racial issues. In the United States, that's impossible. It's impossible to class out of racism. We saw that with President Obama. When President Obama became president, things started to happen in the Senate that had never happened before. At the State of the Union address, one of the senators called him a liar. We had never seen that before. He was not able to pass anything through the House and the Senate. So anti-black racism is at the core. It is part of what makes America America. And so even though you, on a kind of one-to-one level, can have relations with people and live a reasonable life, when it comes down to it, you are still the non-person that you were when you arrived on the boat during slavery up to now. And where did those attitudes come from? They came from Europe. They didn't spring up in the United States all on their own. There is a long history that was weaponized in the United States. But it is a long history.
I think it's Bryan Stevenson who says that the North won the war, but the South
won the narrative. Yeah. Exactly. Bryan Stevenson, have you guys read Bryan Stevenson? We love Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson, if I had to replace a self with myself,
you'd go for him.
I would go for Bryan Stevenson.
He's amazing.
He is amazing. He's a lawyer. After he graduated from Harvard Law, he worked, I think, for a little while for the Seven Poverty Center. Then he ended up starting something called the Equal Justice Initiative. And he has gotten people out of prison who had life sentence. It was a case that children were given life terms. He was able to get rid of that. He's also started a museum, a lynching museum, so that, like in Germany with the markers, we could have a historical marker for the institutionalized killing of Black people across centuries.
There is a horrific amount of Black people in prison in the States.
Yeah, and not accidentally. There's a great film called 13 by Ava DuVernay, in which we have white American lawmakers who say this policy under Nixon and Reagan became the policy, this trumped-up idea of drugs as a reason to incarcerate it was like a plan. It was like, we know of other plans, but it was like a plan to get rid of Black people. And so the incarceration rates of Black men especially was an organized effort by the state to get rid of the voting population of Black people who would necessarily go Democratic, or probably would go Democratic. And so now it's just, people think, oh no, they committed crimes. No, they did not. Some of them did, because every person is capable of everything. But the majority of people, now that white people have been taking opioids and addicted to them, you no longer criminalize for drug taking. It is now a medical issue. But marijuana was a criminal offense because it was used as an excuse to incarcerate Black people.
There is no end to a lot of this misery, apparently, but there is, for instance, you and Bryan Stevenson and a lot of other people who write, tell, talk, act. And one of the things that Bryan Stevenson said, it's not that it's going to be about him, but
it could be about him.
It could be about him
he
because
is my other person.
I know he could be. Actually, I'm talking to your other person. But he said a lot about proximity, which I found so interesting. That this can only happen. All these things can only happen because we have isolated people. There's no proximity between the power, the institutional power, and the people who live in poverty or have problems like that.
He uses proximity in two ways. One is he says that we should, as people, think proximate, understand our capacities for change relative to the people around us. That it's not over there, it's here. And if you want, people say, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. There is somebody in your neighborhood, somebody in your community you could be helping. There are policies at your job. There are things that affect others. And that you don't have to be Bryan Stevenson. You don't have to, argue cases in front of the Supreme Court. So he uses it that way as well. But also in terms of thinking about our tendency towards indifference, which I think we all suffer from. I know I suffer from it. Not indifference exactly, but that sense that there's nothing I as an individual could do that would affect enough change for it to matter. And so we end up doing nothing. And what I appreciate with Stevenson is that he says, you just got to start, and you see the man as someone who started and started and started and started.
When you were going to publish this wonderful collection, Don't Let Me Be Lonely, you had to change publisher. Is that not true?
That means that you did your homework. That is true. You know it's true. I was living in London when George Bush was running for president. And I was listening to the debates, and somebody asked him about James Beard. And you might not know who James Beard is, but James Beard was a guy who lived in Jasper, Texas, and went to a party. On his way home from the party, he saw a white guy he knew. The white guy was with two other white guys. They said, "You want a lift back?" And he said, "Sure." They took him, so he willingly got into their truck. And they then beat him up, tied him to the back of the car, and dragged him along country roads until his limbs came apart from his body. So when they got him, they found like his head here, his arm there, down the road. They just, And this thing was so horrific, it sort of imprinted itself on me in a way that nothing else had. And at that point, I thought, I need to rethink the way I work and write and engage the American public. And so I wrote Don't Let Me Be Lonely. Partly because George Bush said, somebody asked him about it because he was governor of Texas at the time it happened, and they said, "Bush, he's running for president." They said, "So Bush, what happened with James Beard?" Because I don't think I was the only one. I think the American public in general was a little bit devastated by this lynching by car that had just happened. And he said, "Oh, I don't remember." And I thought, you don't remember? And now you are going to be our president? You don't remember? And so I wrote Don't Let Me Be Lonely. And my publishers, Grove Press, they had represented me for my two books before, and I loved Grove Press because they were an old press, and they had represented Beckett and writers who I love. And so I was like, they represent Beckett, they represent me. I love Beckett, I must love me. And they said to me, "This is not poetry, and when you write another poetry book, we'll publish it, but we're not publishing this." And for a minute, I was upset. I was like, what? But then I was luckily at a point in my career where there were enough other publishers who said, "Hello, we'll take it." And Grey Wolf, who I ultimately went with, have actually been the perfect publishers for me. They're fantastic. They have a kind of social justice agenda. They let me do what I want, which is great. And they're like a small family in Minnesota. So it's very easy to work with them. So in some ways, it doesn't feel like a tragedy. It feels like it was a gift in the way it all turned out in the end.
There was another person you remembered in this context, and that context of Bush saying that, and that was your mother. You heard your mother's voice saying you don't remember because you don't care.
Yeah, exactly. The voices that you keep, you hold, are your families, and then it used to be, I could say maybe Trump, but Trump has said so many things that are like he has managed to regularize the outrageous so that you no longer hold on to it. You just let it go as just...
in there, out there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, out there as well.
Unfortunately, with a lot of power. And that's really the problem. I mean, he says something about Mexicans, and the next thing we know, people being shot in El Paso. Even in places like the Northwest, migrant populations are still being employed to do the work, and then they call ICE before they have to pay them. So they have them harvest and do all that, and then before payday, they call in ICE and they're deported.
Yesterday you did a reading which some of you probably heard and some of you probably didn't. But you were reading from Citizen about Serena Williams, because this is the US Open Times and you're a tennis nerd. But you're not just a tennis nerd. You have an issue called Serena Williams playing tennis in a very white space. Tell us a little about Serena.
Well, Serena Williams is, for me, just the public example of dynamics that people go through all the time in their work, in their lives. But with Serena, you get to see it, and you get to share it, and people get to... And for the case of Citizen, I needed an example that was researchable. Something that people wouldn't have to take my word for it, because I think one of the consequences of white defensiveness is the race to dismiss these moments as individual, as personal, as subjective, as oversensitivity. All of those things are ready to go. And so in that sense, I didn't want to use my life as an example. But Serena's life, when you have the repetition of these events over and over and over again, it becomes a nice sort of dish to look into. And so I interviewed Serena for the New York Times. And you're a journalist, so you know this. You go in and you have the questions, and in some ways you want the piece to do something that other pieces haven't done, right?
That's the dream.
That's the dream. You don't want to just repeat what has been said again and again and again. But one of the things that I found myself... it was kind of like a deep sadness that I didn't want her to have to talk about her own subjugation. I needed to do it for the article, but I didn't want her having to look at her life in that way, and to have to reduce her accomplishments or mitigate them around the kind of racism she's had to negotiate. And so what happened in the interview was I would say something and she would give me some as Nelson Mandela said. I'm like, some quote. I was just like, what? And I could see her resistance, her wanting to say, life's life, I move forward, da 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 da. So
was it a kind of survival strategy?
I think so. I don't think you can go in there. And I might be wrong, but I think part of what has prevented her from winning this next Grand Slam, because she's one away from the homophobic Margaret Court, and which is partly why I want her to get that that last one, is I think she's trying to be good. She's trying to hold back her emotional responses. And because of that, she's not playing to her fullest. And why Serena is beloved by people, especially me, all right, no, especially me, is because she over time has brought her full emotional self to the court. So if you piss her off, she's pissed off. If you make her happy, she's happy. You don't seem to have a kind of negotiation of the self, unlike her sister, Venus, who you seem to get one Venus no matter what's happening. Whereas Serena seems to be cognizant of what is happening as it's happening. And so I think once you know it, you can't go back. And so it'll be interesting to see how she negotiates being a mother with a daughter who she has to be an example for, a woman who's playing people who hold her up as a mentor at this point in her career, and also somebody who is at the end of their career as somebody approaching 40, which, Roger Federer, now, who we should all want to be is Roger Federer. Because Roger Federer is such an interesting contrast to, they're both relatively the same age. They're both the top of their relative games. And, but Federer comes from such a privileged life. And Serena comes from a battle. And they've landed in the same place. And but both are struggling with their aging and their brilliance at the same time. It's really fascinating.
You are a nerd.
It's just really fascinating to watch. It's a piece I kind of would like to write, the sort of the two of them up against each other.
That sounds like a very, very good idea. The thing is that a lot of the texts in here, for instance, have references, and in Citizens as well, because Serena you can go and watch on YouTube. And if you print her name, it'll come up Serena Williams angry, Serena Williams meltdown, Serena, this kind of, because she has really been angry.
She has been angry, and she should be angry.
And she should be angry.
And sometimes she shouldn't be angry, but she can't tell, because there's so many times when she should be angry. And so you sort of lose perspective in terms of how to read what's happening.
But it's about her body as a black body in this white space.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote the piece for the Times, I loved writing for the Times. My editor is a fantastic editor. But I handed in the piece, and they said, the only thing that's missing from the piece is that you didn't write about Serena's body. And I said, what do you mean write about Serena's body? And they said, Serena's body. The readers want to hear about Serena's body. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. And then it came back again. The only thing that's missing. So I did this. Serena was wearing a jumpsuit when I interviewed her. And I wrote something like, Serena Williams is wearing an enviable jumpsuit. I would like that jumpsuit. I would. And that was it. But I think what people, and I am being generous here and not saying white, but what people don't understand is the way to stop the racism is to stop the racism. It's not, you have to have an intervention. So you just don't do it. Just don't do it. But that piece in the New York Times was one, they sent me a list of every article that ended up quoting that piece. And what shocked me was it took till I wrote that piece for people to begin to see Serena. So what were all those other people seeing all those years? That's the thing. That's the thing. So one has to really go in with a consciousness that what you're doing is a rerouting of a kind of white supremacist understanding of the world.
This is something that you teach.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about how you prepare a course for a very diverse group of students about whiteness. I mean, there's a lot of African American studies, there's a lot of study into blackness, but whiteness isn't really studied, is it?
No. Well, in the 1980s, there was a whiteness curriculum that began, and Toni Morrison was a part of that. But people began to think that whiteness studies meant talking about Blondie as a great singer, rather than looking at white dominance.
Okay.
And how white dominance plays in the, so then it kind of, and then it was like all these white professors got confused about like this issue of centralizing whiteness. And, but now we're back again, because actually Donald Trump has put us there. And so in the class, we really are interested in how white dominance has come to be what is perceived as normality. So that you read a book and it says, some people attended hangies on Sunday afternoon. And that's a line from Susan Sontag's. And we love Susan Sontag. She's amazing. But some people, the only black people who attended hangings were hanging. So the only people who were attending the lynchings were white people. So why cannot you say white people attended lynchings on Sunday afternoons? What's wrong with actually naming the people who were there as white? I have never received as much hate mail as when that class went out. It was so bad, we put in a security system at our house. There are other professors who have shut down their classes. In Wisconsin, the government, the state government has told the University of Wisconsin they would take away the school funding if they did not shut down that class. So it's not just idiosyncratic, don't talk about it. It's national policy. 1790 immigration policy, the first real immigration policy in the United States, said voting and landholding belongs to white Anglo-Saxon men. That's the standard. Everything that happened from then to now has been, how do you open up that sentence? How do you open it up to include women, and not even just Anglo-Saxon. It's like, how do you include Italian men, Irish men, Greek men? You all were okay, but everybody else. So that's been the fight. And up till now, even though blacks were given the vote, black men were given the vote in 1864, it was immediately taken away with what were called black codes that went on the state level. So you don't like the federal government, on the state level, you institute laws that nullify what the state has said must happen. And who did those? Lawmakers. 73% of elected officials in the United States are white men. 31% of the population. 93% of elected officials in the United States are white people governing the people. So how is it that the agenda is not white-centered? Obviously, it's white-centered. And then you have what we now, I don't know if you've heard the term the squad, the 4 women in the house who are not white. Send her back, presidential refusal to have them enter Israel. So that's what we do in the class. We go through, what I try and do is run the historical facts up against the cultural facts and see sort of where we intersect. And then the students come up with their own projects. And at the end of the term, we have a public art opening, which includes everything from films to handmade books to, it's been very successful, I think.
We have so much to talk about and so little time left, because I want you to end on a reading. But I did want to also on this occasion ask you about the using of the I as in your poetry, because there was something I found so striking, that black people did not have an I because they were seen as commodities. The law had to give them the I. Is that correctly understood?
Yeah, they were property. Under slavery, blacks were considered property. It wasn't only in the United States. It was also in Britain, for example. So when, do you know the Turner slave ship painting? That painting is of an event that happened. The captain got lost, and so the ships was traveling from Ghana to the West Indies. It got lost. It was in the storm. So they were running out of food. And so what the captain was, he took the black slaves and he dumped them overboard. Because the question was, if they died of illness, the insurance wouldn't cover them. But if you lost property, you can then make an insurance claim for the lost property. So there's, it's Britain, and so by the time you have the United States and slavery in the United States, nobody is considered a person, and that continues. Like that, when I say anti-black slavery, that's really what I'm talking about. Black people are not considered people in the United States. If they were considered people, they would not be shot and left on the street for 4 hours as Michael Brown's body was. It's just a fact. If a white, blonde, and blonde is operative, girl goes missing, the entire country shuts down. You can kill as many black people as you want, and white people don't even remember their names. So that's just, I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm just referring to what has happened. And so the legacy of that is the fact that not only were black people considered property, whiteness then became a valued property in and of itself, which is the funny turn that happened. And so now whiteness is itself property. So the space is white. And if a black person walks into the space, they have somehow entered a white space, even though it's just a building. And whiteness is now valued as property. So you cannot go there. You cannot enter there. I mean, and that's probably true in Europe too, that you walk into a space. And what always happens to me is that someone comes up to me and they say, "How can I help you? Can I help you?" And there are 100 people in the store, but I get special treatment. "Can I help you?" And I say, "No, I'm okay." And then they move, but within sight of me. So then I turn around and I wave. "I'm doing okay, it's okay. You can calm down." But so that's been the sort of reverse of this notion of property, that now the spaces are considered white.
It's funny, but it's not funny at all.
Well, it's sort of funny.
It's sort of funny. Okay, your other self, Bryan Stevenson, says that you must never give up hope. And I think he learned that from Rosa Parks, who he met. I think it's hopeful to read your literature. So thank you for giving us that hope. And will you please end this by reading this for us?
So I'm going to read, the book begins with a series of microaggressions. These are small moments that happen in day to day. And this was told to me by a professor who teaches on the West Coast. And I'm telling you this because the fantasy of Northern California is that it is like the land of the open-minded, yoga, Buddhist, extreme wealth. The new therapist specializes in trauma counseling. You have only ever spoken on the phone. Her house has a side gate that leads to a back entrance she uses for patients. You walk down a path bordered on both sides with deer grass and rosemary to the gate, which turns out to be locked. At the front door, the bell is a small round disc that you press firmly. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house! What are you doing in my yard?" It's as if a wounded Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd has gained the power of speech. And though you back up a few steps, you manage to tell her you have an appointment. "You have an appointment?" She spits back. Then she pauses. Everything pauses. "Oh," she says, followed by, "Oh yes, that's right, I'm sorry, I am so, so sorry."
Claudia Rankine.